beneath the vast, unforgiving Arizona sky, where the sun bleaches bone and history is written in dust and blood, a rancher's simple act of desperation collided with a destiny etched in ancient stone. John Carter needed help to save the land that was his life's blood. He did not expect his answer to arrive in the form of a solitary Apache woman on a weathered mare, her eyes holding the silence of the mountains, who looked at his worn face and spoke a promise that would unravel his world. I am Lokoja. I have come to work, and I have come to be your bride. This is not a story of stolen glances or sweet courtship, but of two wounded souls standing at the precipice of forgotten treaties, long-buried secrets, and a hard land that demands a price for every drop of water and moment of peace. It is the story of how a frontier built on division found a fragile hope in the most unexpected union of all. The drought had clenched its bony fist around the Triple C Ranch, squeezing the life from the land. John Carter stood on his splintered porch, squinting against the relentless sun, and saw not his legacy, but a slow death. The creek was a dusty scar. The cattle were walking skeletons, their lowing a constant, mournful hymn. His two hired hands, the Dawson brothers, had quit a week ago, loading their meager belongings with averted eyes, muttering about cursed ground and better prospects up north. John couldn't blame them. The ranch, won by his grandfather in a poker game and hardened by his father's sweat, was failing in his hands. He was a man carved from the same stubborn rock as the hills, just past 40, with patience worn thin by loss. His wife, Mary, was 5 years buried, taken by a fever that raged like a prairie fire. The loneliness, since then, was a deeper silence than the desert night, a hollow space he'd filled with nothing but work and the fading memory of her laugh. Now, even the work was turning to dust. He'd posted a notice in the scant town of Red Creek, a simple plea for a strong back. No one had come. The town folk were struggling themselves, and the shadow of the nearby Apache reservation, a constant, uneasy presence, made many wary. The past here was a shallow grave, and the bones of old conflicts seemed to rattle with every hot wind. So when he saw the rider approaching at dusk, a silhouette against the bleeding sun, he felt a flicker of hope, quickly dampened by confusion. The rider sat tall and unhurried, not on a cowboy's stocky quarter horse, but on a nimble, paint-spotted mare. As the figure neared, the setting sun revealed not a man, but a woman. She was Apache, her hair a long, black river down her back, her face all strong plains and quiet observation. She wore a simple, worn dress of calico over deerskin leggings, practical and stark. She reined in before the porch, her dark eyes taking in the parched yard, the leaning barn, the man rooted to his spot. They held a weight of years, those eyes, a knowledge that seemed older than the mountains. John Carter. Her voice was low, clear, cutting through the evening stillness. That's me. He wiped his hands on his denims, feeling oddly exposed. Can I help you, ma'am? I am Lokoja, she stated. I saw your paper in the town. I have come to work. John was stunned. A woman? An Apache woman? His mind raced through a dozen practical and cultural obstacles. I need help with cattle, fencing, hauling water. It's hard labor, miss. Sunup to sundown. I see the work, she said, her gaze sweeping again. I see the land is thirsty. My hands are not afraid of hard things. There was an undeniable steadiness in her, a competence in the way she held her horse, in the directness of her look. But it was impossible. The disapproval from town would be instant, violent maybe. The Dawson brothers would have laughed themselves sick. He shook his head, a gesture of weary resignation. I appreciate you riding out, truly, but it wouldn't be fitting. We're safe. For either of us. Lokoja did not move. She studied him, not with anger, but with a profound, measuring intensity. The silence stretched, filled only by the sigh of the wind. Then she spoke again, and her words fell into John's world like stones into a still pond, sending out ripples that would touch every corner of his life. There is more, she said, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something else in her eyes. Not uncertainty, but a fierce, determined resolve. My grandfather was called Red Hawk. Your father was Thomas Carter. They made a promise, under an oak tree that is now dead, by the old dry spring. When the lands were divided, and my people were moved, they spoke of a bond to mend what was broken. A bond of family. John stared, a cold trickle of memory seeping through. His father, on his deathbed, speaking in a fevered murmur about promises and debts, words John had dismissed as the ramblings of a dying man. What bond? Lokoja took a slow breath, her shoulders squaring as if against a great weight. I have come to work, she repeated, the words now a foundation for what was to come. And I have come to be your bride. The world seemed to tilt. John heard a sharp ringing in his ears. Bride? It was absurd, a madness born of the heat and his desperation. He looked at this stranger, this woman from a world he knew only through suspicion and old grievances, and uttered a choked, "You're out of your mind." Or I am. The promise was real, she insisted, her voice gaining a steel edge. It was a vow between warriors for a time when the land would sicken again. The land is sick. My people on the reservation, the government promises are empty words on rotten paper. Your ranch dies. My people starve. The old men remember the vow. They sent me. Sent you. John echoed, anger beginning to simmer through his shock. To marry me? Like some transaction? That's not how things are done. Not in my world. Not in any sane world. Your world is dust, Lokoja said simply, gesturing to the dying fields. Mine is a cage. The vow was for such a time. I do not ask for your feeling. I offer my strength for your land. In return, this place, your ranch, becomes a refuge for my family. A place where they can work, can eat, where the children can know something besides hunger. It was a raw, brutal calculus, stripped of all romance. A marriage of pure necessity. John turned away, running a hand through his sweat-damp hair. He thought of Mary, her gentle touch, her soft ways. This was a betrayal of her memory, a grotesque parody. But then he looked at the empty corral, the dwindling woodpile, the relentless, cloudless sky. He was going to lose everything. And here stood a solution as stark and uncompromising as the land itself. I need a worker, not a wife, he said, his back to her. You will have both. Or you will have neither, she replied. The finality in her tone was absolute. He faced her again, seeing not just a woman now, but a force of will as formidable as the drought. Where would you even sleep? The barn is sufficient. For now. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. The town will have a fit. There'll be trouble. Trouble I know, Lokoja said. Hunger I know. Empty promises I know. This, she nodded at the ranch, is a fight I choose. Night had fallen fully, a blanket of stars over a desperate land. John Carter, a man of simple needs and broken dreams, stood at a crossroads with no good paths, only impossible ones. He looked at Lokoja, a statue on her horse, waiting. His pride screamed no. The ghost of his wife pleaded no. But the sight of his father's ranch, the only thing he had left, crumbling into nothing, whispered yes. His voice was gravel when he finally spoke. Start tomorrow at first light. The north fence is down. We'll figure the rest later. A slight, almost imperceptible nod. I will be here. She turned the mare and rode off a short distance, not back toward the reservation road, but toward a small copse of cottonwoods near the dry creek bed. He watched her go, a sense of surreal dislocation swallowing him. He had just hired a worker. He had just acquired a bride. And as he stood alone on the dark porch, he knew, with a cold certainty, that nothing would ever be simple again. The dawn brought not clarity, but the harsh light of a new reality. John emerged from the house as the sky lightened to see Lokoja already at the woodpile, splitting logs with a practiced, efficient rhythm. She had changed into a sturdier pair of men's trousers and a work shirt, her hair tightly braided. She did not look at him, simply continued her work, each swing of the axe precise and powerful. Wordlessly, he fetched a second axe and joined her. They worked in silence for an hour. The only sounds the thwack of blades biting into wood and the distant, worried call of a crow. The silence was not comfortable, but it was not entirely hostile. It was the silence of two people assessing a difficult task. When a sizable pile was stacked, John finally spoke. "The north fence. It's about a mile out. We'll take the wagon, bring posts, and wire." She merely nodded, loading tools into the battered flatbed with ease. The drive was jarringly quiet. John's mind was a storm of doubts and practical worries. How would he explain this to anyone? What did this vow truly entail? He glanced at her profile, etched against the morning sky. She was watching the land, her eyes reading the landscape in a way he could not, noting the types of parched grass, the track of a rabbit, the subtle lay of the stone. "This promise," he began, the words clumsy, "between my father and your grandfather." What was it exactly? Lokoja kept her eyes on the horizon. "When the soldiers came and the talking was done with lies, your father was different. He spoke against the moving of my people from the canyon springs. He was alone in this. My grandfather, Red Hawk, saw he had a straight tongue. When a sickness came to your cattle one winter, Red Hawk brought medicine herbs. They saved many. Under the old oak they spoke. They said if the land turned against both peoples again, a bridge of family should be built to share strength. It was a promise of last resort." "A marriage promise?" John asked, skepticism thick in his voice. "A promise of alliance. In my grandfather's time, such alliances were sealed this way. Your father understood this. He gave his word." John fell silent. It sounded like the stuff of legends, not the pragmatic, hard-bitten father he remembered. Yet, he recalled the strange reverence his father had always held for that particular dead oak by the spring, a place he'd often visit alone. Reaching the fence line, they found disaster. A flash flood from a distant storm had torn through the arroyo, sweeping away 100 yards of posts and wire. It was a day's work for two men. Without speaking, Lokoja set to work digging new post holes. John worked beside her, and he soon realized her strong back was an understatement. She worked with an endurance that matched his own, her movements economical, never wasted. By mid-morning, the sun was a hammer. John passed her his canteen. She hesitated, then took it, drinking deeply before handing it back. "Thank you." It was the first unprompted thing she'd said. "You know the land," he observed as they set a heavy post together. "It is my teacher. It tells you things if you listen. The earth here is angry. It has been cut by plows and bled by cattle. It needs to heal. It needs water." John grunted, heaving the post upright. "It needs respect first. Then water will come." Her words irked him. What did she know of his respect for this land? He'd poured his life into it. Yet, looking at the eroded arroyo, he couldn't argue. The work continued. As they strung wire, John's hand slipped, and a barb ripped a deep gash across his palm. He cursed, blood welling instantly. Before he could react, Lokoja was at his side. She took his hand, her grip firm but not rough. From a small pouch at her belt, she took a pinch of a crumbled, grayish-green herb. "Yarrow," she said, pressing it to the wound. Then she tore a strip from the clean inner layer of her shirt sleeve and bound his hand expertly. The bleeding slowed almost at once, the pain dulling to a throb. He stared at his bandaged hand, then at her. "Thank you." "A small thing," she said, returning to the wire. But it wasn't a small thing. It was a crack in the wall between them, a moment of unasked-for, practical care. The test came that afternoon. A cloud of dust announced a visitor. Tom Hendricks, Red Creek's sheriff, and a man whose dislike for the Apache was well known, rode up on his sorrel gelding. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. John Carter and an Apache woman working side by side on his fence. "John," Hendricks said, tipping his hat back, his gaze fixed on Lokoja, who continued working as if he weren't there. "Heard you had some new help." "That's right, Tom." "Lokoja, this is Sheriff Hendricks." Lokoja paused, gave his sheriff a brief, neutral glance, and a slight nod, then went back to tightening a wire splice. Hendricks's face tightened. "That a fact? Where's she from?" "The reservation," John said, keeping his voice even. She got papers to be off reservation? For work. John felt a heat rise in his chest. She's my guest, Tom. Helping out. We're not causing any trouble. Guests don't usually mend fence, Hendrik sneered. He eyed Lokoja with open contempt. Might cause trouble just by being here. Folks in town are already talking. Don't need any misunderstandings. Lokoja stopped working. She turned fully to face the sheriff, her expression calm, but her eyes like flint. What misunderstanding, Sheriff? A man needs help on his land. I provide help. The law speaks against this. Her directness clearly took Hendricks aback. He sputtered. The law says I keep the peace. This situation has a history of not being peaceful. The only history here is a broken fence, John said, stepping slightly between Lokoja and the sheriff. We're fixing it. That's all. Hendricks looked from one to the other, a slow realization dawning in his eyes. It wasn't just hired help. The dynamic was something else, something that unsettled him deeply. You watch yourself, John. You're playing with fire. He shot a last, venomous look at Lokoja. And you, any step out of line, you'll be back on the reservation before you can blink. He wheeled his horse and rode off, leaving a pall of tension in the dusty air. John let out a long breath. The first shot had been fired. Lokoja returned to the wire, her jaw set. He is a small man with a big fear. He's a man with a badge and friends who think like him, John said grimly. This is what I meant. I did not come expecting flowers, she replied, her voice low. That night, after a supper eaten in near silence at the separate tables of the kitchen and the porch, John found a neat pile of old but clean blankets and a saddle blanket folded into a pallet in the barn loft. He hadn't provided them. She had taken care of herself. He stood in the dark yard, looking at the sliver of lantern light from the barn's hayloft. He thought of her hands binding his wound, her steady gaze facing down the sheriff, her relentless work. She was not the bride of storybooks. She was a partner in a battle, one he hadn't chosen, but was now undeniably in. And as he listened to the coyotes sing to the indifferent moon, he wondered for the first time if the old vow his father made might have been the wisest thing the stubborn old man ever did. A fragile, wordless rhythm established itself over the next week. They rose before dawn, worked until the sun was high, rested during the brutal peak heat, and worked again until dusk. Lokoja proved herself indispensable. She had an uncanny way with the few remaining cattle, moving among them with a quiet assurance that settled their nervous energy. She spotted a hidden seep in the dry creek bed, just a damn patch others would miss. And with 2 days of careful digging, they had a muddy but precious small water hole for the stock. John found himself watching her, not as a woman, but as a phenomenon. She read the weather in the shapes of clouds, pointed out edible plants he'd always considered weeds, and once tracked a missing calf for 3 miles simply by reading the faintest signs in the dust. Her knowledge was ancient, deep, and practical. It was saving his ranch. The wall between them remained, but it developed gates. They began to exchange necessary words about tasks. The hinges on the south gate are rusted through. I will cut a new stake for the corral. Then, observations. The hawks are circling lower. A storm may come from the east. The old cow in the far pasture is favoring her left foreleg. One evening, exhausted from digging a new irrigation trench, John sat on the porch steps, a tin cup of bitter coffee in his hand. Lokoja came from the barn after tending to her mare, and sat on the ground a few feet away, her back against a post, looking out at the purple twilight. The silence was different tonight, stretched thin but not tense. Why you? John asked suddenly, the question escaping him before he could stop it. Of all your people, why did they send you? Lokoja was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. I have no husband, she said finally, her voice soft in the gathering dark. My father and brother were taken by the coughing sickness 2 winters past. My mother is gone. I am unbound. The old men, they saw I was not afraid of the white man's world. I speak some English, and they saw I would do what was needed for the children, for the elders who remember when the water flowed clean. She paused. Also, I am known to be stubborn. A faint, almost smile touched John's lips. Utisha. Another silence, easier this time. Your woman, Lokoja ventured cautiously. You loved her. It was a statement, not a question. John felt the familiar ache, but it was a duller throb now, mingled with the fatigue in his bones. Yes, very much. This place was ours. Love is a great gift, a strong shelter. She said it without jealousy, without judgment, simply as a recognition of a truth. It was, he whispered. The next morning, the storm she predicted arrived, not a gentle rain, but a violent, short-lived downrush that turned the earth to slick mud and sent torrents raging through the arroyos. They were caught out near the western range, checking on the seep. The sky turned an ugly green, and the wind howled like a banshee. Hail began to fall, stones the size of marbles that stung the skin. There, Lokoja shouted over the gale, pointing to a shallow overhang in a sandstone cliff. They ran for it, scrambling under the rocky shelf just as the hail intensified. They were pressed together in the cramped, damp space, breathing hard, watching the world outside turn into a roaring, white-gray chaos. The closeness was electrifying and awkward. John was acutely aware of her shoulder against his, the quick rise and fall of her chest. The smell of wet earth and her scent, sage and sun-warmed skin, filled the small space. He dared to glance at her. Her face was turned toward the storm, profile strong and calm, her eyelashes beaded with moisture. She was not afraid. She was observing, respecting the power of the sky. As suddenly as it began, the hail stopped, leaving behind a bruised silence and a landscape littered with white pellets. The rain continued, a steady, soaking pour. They would be stuck for a while. Lokoja shifted, drawing her knees up. My grandfather spoke of your father's courage the day of the big flood. He helped pull 3 children from the raging river, Apache children. No one else would. John stared. He never told me that. Some deeds are not for boasting. They are for knowing. She looked at him, her dark eyes serious. You carry that same strength, but it is buried under grief and dust. Her words struck him to the core. No one had spoken to him like that since Mary. No one had seen him so clearly. He had no reply. When the rain eased to a drizzle, they emerged into a washed clean world. The air was cool and sweet. And there, at the head of a nearby wash, a miracle, a trickle of water, clear and steady, was running where before there had been only dust. The storm had unlocked something underground. Lokoja knelt, cupped her hands, drank, and then smiled. It was the first true smile John had seen from her, and it transformed her face, lighting it with a fierce, beautiful joy. The land remembers how to drink, she said. In that moment, looking at her smile and the newborn stream, John felt something shift irreversibly inside him. It wasn't love, not yet. It was the dismantling of an idea. She was no longer just the embodiment of a strange vow or a solution to a labor problem. She was Lokoja, who saved his hand, faced down the sheriff, read the land like a book, and smiled at a trickle of water as if it were a river of gold. The bride, part of her statement, was still a terrifying, foreign concept. But the person part was becoming undeniable. They returned to the ranch house as the sun broke through, steaming the earth. The crisis of the storm had forged a new, unspoken understanding. That night, John did not eat on the porch. He set 2 plates on the worn kitchen table. When Lokoja came in from the barn, she paused, seeing the setting. She met his gaze, gave a slow nod, and sat down. They ate the simple stew together, not as rancher and worker, not as white man and Apache woman, but as 2 people sharing a meal after a long, hard, astonishing day. The silence was finally, truly comfortable. The water changed everything. The small, persistent trickle from the storm-scoured wash was channeled by Lokoja's direction into a series of shallow, spreading ditches that led to the most desperate pastures. It wasn't a flood, but a lifeline. The grass, long dormant, sent up shy green shoots within days. The cattle, sensing the change, grew quieter, their ribs less prominent. Hope, a forgotten tenant, returned to the Triple C. With the immediate crisis easing, the reality of their arrangement pressed in. The town's whispers became shouts. John went into Red Creek for supplies and was met with cold shoulders and hot glares. At the general store, Old Man Peterson counted his change with deliberate slowness. "Heard you're running a charity for squaws out there, John." A couple of ranch hands by the feed sacks laughed, but it was a nervous, ugly sound. "I'm running my ranch, Pete. That's all," John said, his voice tight. "Funny way of doing it. Sheriff's got his eye on you. We all do." The threat hung in the air, thick as the smell of burlap and dried apples. He returned home heavy with dread. Lokoja saw it on his face. She asked no questions. She simply took the sacks of flour and salt from him and stored them away. But her own test was coming. 2 days later, a beat-up reservation truck rattled up the drive. In it were an elderly Apache man, his face a map of wrinkles, and a young woman with a baby in her arms. Lokoja's cousin, Ilan, and her child. They brought news and a plea. The government rations on the reservation were delayed again. Sickness was spreading among the children. The old man, speaking through Lokoja, reiterated the terms of the vow. The ranch was to be a refuge. John watched as Lokoja's composure cracked for the first time. Holding the frail baby, her face was a mask of anguish and steely resolve. She turned to him. They need to stay, to work, to be safe. This was the promise. John felt the walls closing in. One Apache woman was a scandal. A family of them would be a provocation. He imagined Hendrix's reaction, the potential for violence. But he looked at the baby's thin face, at the old man's tired eyes, and then at Lokoja, who stood waiting for him to either fulfill or destroy the fragile trust they'd built. The vow was no longer an abstract legend. It was here, in the needy eyes of his people. The old bunkhouse, he heard himself say, it needs cleaning. They can stay there. The gratitude in Lokoja's eyes was so profound it was almost painful to behold. It was in that moment he truly accepted the full weight of what he had agreed to. This was no longer just about him and Lokoja. It was about building a new, precarious community on the ashes of old hatreds. Elon and the elder, who was called Gray Cloud, integrated with quiet efficiency. Gray Cloud, though frail, possessed a bottomless well of knowledge about desert plants and animal lore. He pointed out a stand of mesquite whose beans could be ground for flour. Elon took over the vegetable garden, reviving it with techniques her grandmother had taught her. The ranch began to hum with a new, subtle energy. John and Lokoja now had not only their own silent understanding, but a shared project, the protection of this tiny enclave. They consulted each other on decisions, their conversations becoming longer, more nuanced. He taught her the workings of the rusted windmill. She showed him how to weave a thatch shade to cool the south side of the house. They were becoming partners. The outside world would not be ignored. Hendrix returned, this time with a deputy. They stood in the yard as John, Lokoja, and Gray Cloud faced them. "This is turning into a settlement, Carter," Hendrix snarled. "This is illegal squatting. I could run the whole lot of you in." Gray Cloud spoke then, in slow, careful English, his voice like dry leaves. "The law you speak of is one law. There is an older law, a promise, of debt paid. This land knows this law." Hendrix looked spooked, as if the old man had cursed him. "I don't care about your heathen laws. I'm giving you a week. Then I'm coming back with a warrant and maybe a few volunteers from town to see these people back where they belong." After they left, a grim determination settled over the ranch. John knew Hendrix wasn't bluffing. The volunteers would be a mob. He spent a long night cleaning his father's old Winchester rifle, a sick feeling in his gut. He hadn't fought in a war only to have one come to his doorstep over this. Lokoja found him on the porch at first light. She didn't speak of the threat. Instead, she said, "Come with me." She led him to the dead oak by the old spring, the place of the vow. At its base, partially hidden by roots, was a flat, mossy stone. With effort, she pried it up. Beneath, it was a rusted metal box. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, were two items, a beautifully beaded Apache knife sheath, and a faded water-stained letter in his father's unmistakable hand. With trembling fingers, John read. It was a contract of sorts, written not to a court, but to God and conscience. It detailed the debt his father felt he owed Red Hawk for saving his herd, and his pledge that, should the descendants of either ever be in dire need, the land of the Triple C would be shared. It was signed by both men, with Thomas Carter's signature bold and clear, and Red Hawk's mark, a hawk's feather drawn in charcoal, beside it. The physical proof was a thunderclap. All John's residual doubt evaporated. This was not Lokoja's story or an old man's tale. This was his father's sworn word, buried in the earth for him to find. He looked at Lokoja, tears in his eyes, not of sadness, but of a staggering, humbling clarity. He meant it. He was a man of his word, she said softly. As you are. She believed that. She believed in him. The weight of that belief was greater than any threat from town. That evening, as they sat with Gray Cloud and Elon, they made a plan. They would not flee. They would stand. But they would also send word to the reservation, to the Apache leaders who remembered the vow. They would not face the coming storm alone. John went to sleep that night, not with fear, but with a strange, solid peace. He had found his father's truth. He had found a partner's respect. And he was ready to fight for what was against all odds, beginning to feel like a family. The week of grace was a time of tense preparation. John rode to the far edges of the county to send a telegram to a sympathetic lawyer in Tucson, a friend of his father's, explaining the situation and enclosing a copy of the unearthed pledge. On the reservation, Gray Cloud's grandson, a young man who could read and write, spread the story of the vow and Hendrix's threat. A slow simmer of anger and solidarity began among the Apache families who had known Red Hawk. Lokoja and John worked side by side, but now their movements were synchronized, their communication often just a look or a nod. The impending confrontation had stripped away the last remnants of formality. One afternoon, mending harnesses in the barn, their hands brushed as they reached for the same awl. The contact sent a jolt through John, not of surprise, but of a deep, undeniable current. He didn't pull away. Neither did she. They looked at each other in the dusty shaft of sunlight, and in that silent, breathless moment, the last wall crumbled. The partnership had become something more intimate, a connection forged in shared purpose, and now acknowledged in a simple touch. The day before Hendrix's deadline, riders appeared, but they were not from town. 7 Apache men on horseback, led by a stern-faced elder, approached the ranch. They were armed with rifles, their expressions grave. John's heart hammered, fearing a different kind of conflict. But Lokoja walked out calmly and spoke to them in their language. After a long conversation, the elder dismounted and approached John. "I am Nantan, son of Red Hawk's brother," the man said in careful English. "We have come to stand with a promise. The sheriff's law is not the only law here." They set up a discreet camp in a draw near the ranch house, out of sight but ready. The Triple C was now a fortress, defended not just by one man, but by a shared history. Hendrix arrived at noon on the 7th day. He had not brought a mob, but he had brought 6 men from town, all armed, their faces set in lines of prejudice and nervous excitement. They pulled up in a cloud of dust, dismounting before the ranch house. "Time's up, Carter," Hendrix called out. "Send them out, or we're coming in to get them." The front door of the house opened. John stepped out, alone, the old Winchester held loosely, not pointed, but present. "They're staying, Tom. This is their home." "The hell it is," one of the townsmen, a lanky bigot named Clyde, shouted. It was then that Lokoja walked out from the side of the house to stand beside John. Then Elon, holding her baby, and Gray Cloud emerged from the bunkhouse. And then, from the arroyo and behind the barn, the 7 Apache riders appeared, walking their horses forward to form a silent, imposing semicircle behind John and Lokoja. Hendrix and his men froze, their bravado evaporating. The odds had shifted dramatically. "This is private property," John said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "You have no warrant, and you are not welcome. There's a legal binding promise that grants these people the right to be here, signed by my father and Red Hawk. I have sent it to a lawyer. The fighting you want, it won't just be with me. It will be with all of them, and then it will be in a court of law." Hendrix's face was purple with rage and humiliation. He looked at the stoic Apache riders, at John's unwavering stance, at Lokoja standing proud and unafraid beside him. He knew this was a battle he would not only lose today, but one that would end his career. The volunteers behind him were already backing toward their horses, muttering, "This ain't over, Carter," Hendrix spat, but the threat was hollow. "It is for today," John replied. "Now, get off my land." They left, their retreat as dusty and inglorious as their arrival. A cheer went up from the Apache riders, a short, sharp sound of victory. John let out a shuddering breath, the tension draining from him. He looked at Lokoja. Her eyes were shining with triumph and relief. Without thinking, he reached for her hand. She clasped it firmly, her calloused fingers intertwining with his. It was a public declaration, more powerful than any words. The crisis had passed. The ranch was safe. The vow was honored. That night, they had a feast. Elon cooked a stew with meat and the mesquite flower. Stories were told around a fire. Gray Cloud speaking of Red Hawk's bravery, John sharing a rare, funny memory of his father. Lokoja translated, her voice flowing between the two worlds, weaving them together. Later, when the others had retired, John and Lokoja stood by the corral fence under a sky dense with stars. The air was cool, scented with sage and wood smoke. "You called it home today," she said softly. "For them. It is their home," he said. Then he turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "Lokoja, this started as a vow, a transaction. It's not that anymore. Not for me." She looked up at him, her face silvered in the starlight. "For me also, it is not. I don't know how to be a husband in this arrangement we made," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But I know I want you here, not as a worker, not just as a partner for the land, but as my partner, in all of it." A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "My grandfather's vow brought me to your fence. My heart chooses to stay at your side, John Carter." He leaned down and kissed her then, a slow, tender kiss that held the promise of a difficult but shared future. It was a seal not on an old treaty, but on a new one, written in the language of mutual respect, hard-won trust, and a love that had grown, quietly and stubbornly, from the very dust they had fought to save. The Triple C Ranch was never the same again. It became a quiet legend, a place where a dried-up creek found its song again, where two lonely worlds touched and created something stronger, and where a promise made under a dead oak finally bore living fruit against all odds in the harsh and beautiful desert.